So welcome to this video. We are going to talk about Java. Notice that this course is not for beginners, so you should know the basics of programming. I have a C programming course on this channel. Watch it, learn the basics of programming, and then watch this video to learn Java. Notice that Java is an object-oriented programming language, and we are not going to cover OOP in this course. We are going to get familiar with Java, we are going to learn the basics, and in another video we will cover object-oriented programming. So I'm going to use IntelliJ IDEA as the IDE for this course. So go to this link, I will put it in the description, and after that press on download. And over here, download the community edition, it is free. When you open IntelliJ for the first time, you will see something like this. Over here, choose new project, and on the left side, choose Java. And over here, you have to select the JDK. So to be able to write and run Java programs on your computer, you have to set up your environment. To do that, you have to download what's called a JDK or Java Development Kit. There are a lot of tutorials that show you how to download a JDK and set up your environment. Now as you see over here, we have an option to download a JDK, but I'm using the Ultimate Edition of IntelliJ, so I don't know if this is available in the Community Edition. Okay, so after you download the JDK and set up your environment, you have to select it over here, and after that press Next. Now over here, choose Create Project from Template, and as you can see, Command Line App is selected. Now press Next. Over here we will give a name to our project. Let's say it is called Learn Java. Now regarding the base package, it can be anything you want. For example, you can put com.yourname. Now down here press finish and the project will be created. Now here we are inside the project. Let me close this panel, and over here we will write some code. As you see, we have a file that is called main.java. Inside this file we have this statement, and over here we have a class. Now as I said, Java is an object-oriented programming language. So in Java we have classes and objects, but we will not worry about that in this course. What's important is that inside this class we have a main method. This is called a method or a function. A method is basically a function that is inside a class, okay? So this main function or main method is the starting point of execution of every Java program. So inside this function we are going to write some code. And from now on I will call it a method, alright? Now as I said, you should know the basics of programming. Now let's get started with the tutorial. Over here we are creating a single line comment and a multi-line comment. So to create a single line comment, put 2 forward slashes, and to create a multi-line comment, we use a forward slash and then an asterisk, and we end it with an asterisk forward slash. This is it regarding comments. Now let's talk about the basic program structure in Java. Each program in Java contains at least one class. This is why this class, which is called main, was created automatically, alright? Now inside each class we can have a main method, and over here we have this main method inside the main class. And this main method is the starting point of execution of every Java program. Now let's talk about variables and data types. So in Java we have primitive types and we also have objects, because it is an object-oriented programming language. So let's first of all talk about primitive types. So Java is a strongly typed language. So if you know Python or JavaScript, this idea will be new to you. Every variable in Java must have a type, and it can only contain data that is compatible with its type. For example, we can create a variable of type int to store integers. So first of all specify the type, and then leave a space, and then put the name of the variable. So to name variables and methods in Java, we use the camel case notation. So suppose that this variable is called number of rooms, we will call it like this. The first letter of the first word is a small letter, and after that we capitalize the first letter of each word, alright? Now let's initialize the value of this variable to be equal to 5, for example. So since this variable is an integer, we cannot store other than integers inside this variable. For example, let's try to store 5.6. As you can see, we have an error. Let's see what this error says. So over here we are trying to store a double inside an integer. A double is basically a number with a decimal part. So if we want to store 5.6 inside an integer, we are going to lose the 0.6. So since data loss is going to happen over here, Java will not automatically convert 5.6 to 5. The programmer should explicitly tell Java to convert 5.6 to 5 or to an integer. So to do that, before 5.6, add 2 parentheses, and inside it, we will tell Java to convert 5.6 to an integer, okay? So now 5 is going to be stored inside the variable number of rooms. Now let's have a look at other types. We have a type which is called the char, short for character. Let's create a variable called c, and let's initialize it with the letter a. So characters in Java should be put in single quotes, as you can see. And over here we are storing the letter a inside the variable c. Now let's talk about the float data type. Let's create a variable called f. Inside this variable, we can store numbers with a decimal point. Let's say 3.4. As you see over here, we have an error. Let's have a look. As you can see, we are trying to store a double inside a float. So Java considers all numbers with decimal part as doubles. And since a double has more precision than a float, then Java will not convert the 3.4 double to a float because it might lose some data. So to tell Java that this is a float, we can add a letter F over here, a small f or a capital F, we have the same thing. And now Java knows that this is a float and it will store it inside the variable f. Now let's do it in another way. I will remove the letter F and I will tell Java to convert the 3.4 double to a float. So over here we are using casting. Now let's create a variable of type double. Let's call it D for example, and inside it we can store numbers with a decimal point, obviously. So let's say 7.6 for example. Now let's create a variable of type boolean. Let's call it B and let's initialize it to be true for example. Or we can use the false keyword, alright? Now we have another way to store integers. We have a type that is called short. We also have a byte and long for example. The difference between these types and the integer type is the number of bytes allocated inside the memory and the range of numbers we can store inside them. So you can read about that on your own. And this is it regarding variables and data types. We will talk about the string data type in a little bit because it is an object, it is not a primitive type. Now let's talk about constants. If you want to create a constant inside Java, you have to use the final keyword. So let's create a constant integer, let's call it x for example, and it is equal to 3. So now we cannot change the value of x. Let's try to assign 5 to x and we will have an error because x is a constant. Okay, now let's talk about output. In order to print something on the console in Java, we have two methods. I will teach you a shortcut. Type SOUT and choose the first option and have a look over here. We have a method that is called println, which takes a parameter. This method will print the parameter on the console. For example, let's give it 5 and this will print 5 on the console. Let's give it a string. To deal with strings, we put them in double quotes. So let's say hello and this will print hello on the console. Now notice that this method is called println. So it automatically prints a new line. So if we run the program, we will see that we have 5 on the first line and hello in the second line. And after printing hello, we will get to a new line. So now we are over here. So let's use the other method. I'm going to use the print method instead of the println method. Now run the program. And now as you can see, hello is printed directly next to 5. So the println method doesn't insert a new line, alright? And if you simply want to print a new line, first of all, use the println method and remove the parameter. So like this. So now this is going to print a new line. So run the program. And as you see, now we have an empty line over here. Also, we can use escape characters. So for example, I will print 2 \n, run the program. And as you can see, now we have 3 empty lines. The first 2 are because of the \n and the last one is because we are using the println method. So after printing the 2 \n, it will get to a new line. This is that regarding the output. But you might be asking, what is this over here? As we said, Java is an object-oriented programming language, and the println method is not accessible directly. This method is found inside the out object inside the system class. So to access the println method, first of all, we will use the system class, and then we want to access this class using the dot operator. After that, we will access a field or a variable inside the system class. This variable is called out. And then we are going to use the dot operator in order to access the println method of the out object. Actually, this is a variable that references an object, alright? Of course, you don't have to understand this. Just get the idea. This is it regarding the output. Let's talk about the input. In order to read input from the user, we want to create an object in Java. So just like we create a variable of type integer, we can create a variable whose type is an object. Now the type in this case is called scanner. Now over here, choose the first option, and you will see that over here we imported java.util.scanner. So actually we imported a class over here. Think of a class as a type, just like an integer, but it is a complex type. It is not a primitive type. So over here we will use this class or this type in order to create a variable. So let's give a name to this variable. We can call it X or Y or anything. In this case I will call it input because we are going to use it to read input from the user. Now, when we are creating objects in Java, we have to tell Java to actually allocate the object inside the memory. So over here, we declared the object, but we didn't allocate it inside the memory yet. So to allocate it in the memory, we will use the new keyword. So assign the variable to be equal to a new scanner. So have a look over here. Now we are telling Java that we have this variable of type scanner and we actually want you to allocate it inside the memory. So we are using the same name as the class followed by parentheses. So basically this over here is a method. This method is called a constructor. It will create a scanner object inside the memory and return its address. And we are going to store the address inside the input variable. Now we can say that the input variable references an object. Or we can say that the input variable is an object, okay? Now this is related to object-oriented programming, so don't worry about it. Now as you see we have an error because this method should take a parameter. In this case we want to read data from the user from the command line. So over here type system.in. So now we are creating a scanner object that will allow us to read data from the user using the command line. And of course we can write this in one statement. So for example, like this. Now it's perfectly fine if you don't understand all of this over here. As I said, it is related to object-oriented programming. Now let's use the input variable or the input object to read data from the user. So over here, suppose that I want to read an integer and store it inside a variable called x. So integer x is equal to, and now I will use the input object. So I will say input and use the dot operator. Type next, and you will see that we have a method that is called nextInt. This method helps us to read an integer from the user. The integer will be returned and we are storing it inside the variable x. So let's print x, and now let's run the program. As you see over here, the program is waiting for us to enter some value. And as we said, we are reading an integer. So let's enter 78 for example, press enter, and as you can see 78 was printed. This is because we are printing x over here. Now of course, it's not necessary to store the value inside x. If you don't need to store the value, we can use this over here directly. So now, we are reading a value from the user and we are printing it directly. So run the program, and now we have the same thing. Enter an integer, press enter, and you will see it printed. Now I will run the program again, and let's try to enter something different than an integer. For example, a string. Press enter, and as you can see, we got an error. This is called an exception. This is because we are reading an integer, but actually we entered a string. So this exception is an input mismatch exception. And of course, exceptions are outside the scope of this course. So just get the idea. Now let me close this. Of course, we have other methods to read different types of data. For example, we have a next method to read a string, and we have a next double method to read a double. You can check them and other methods on your own. And we are done talking about the input. And we don't need this import anymore. Now let's talk about arrays. Suppose that we want an array of integers. So we want an integer array. So after specifying the type, we put two brackets. After that, we will give the array a name. Let's say the array is called integers, like this. Now listen to this. An array in Java is an object. So similarly to the scanner object, we must tell Java to create the array in the memory using the new keyword. So let's assign this to be equal to, use the new keyword, and over here we want an array of integers of 5 elements for example. So now Java will allocate an array of 5 integers and return its address. And the address will be stored in this variable. And now this variable is an array of 5 elements that are integers. And we can access each element normally, starting from index 0. For example, the first element is equal to 5. And let's print the first element like this. Run the program. And as you see, this is the first element. Now what if we want to print the whole array? So let's print the name of the array and now run the program. You will see that this is printed. This is actually the string representation of this array. Now of course, this is not very helpful. So have a look over here. In Java, we have a class that is called arrays. So type arrays and choose the first option. This class will be imported over here. After that, use the dot operator. And over here, we have a method or a function that takes an array as a parameter. Let's give it our array integers like this. Now this function is going to return a string representation for our array. And it will show all the elements. So run the program. So as you see, this is the string representation of our array. It was returned by this function. And after that, we printed it. This is it regarding arrays. Now, let me close this. I will pause the video and in a little bit we will continue talking about these topics. Okay, I'm back. So let's continue. Now we will talk about strings. A string in Java is actually an object. So we have a class that's called string. So this will be the type for our variable. Let's call the variable x for example. And I will assign this variable to be equal to a string hello. Now as you can see over here, I didn't use the new operator. Actually, we can say we want a new string with the value hello. This will give us the same result. But Java developers made it possible to work with strings like this. So let's print x for example, run the program, and you will see that hello is printed. Now as you see, we have to use double quotes with the strings. Now let's try to use this code over here, and we will have the same result. Run the program. As you see, hello is printed. But have a look over here. It says that new string is redundant. So the recommended way of working with strings is without using the new keyword. Now actually, there is a small difference between using and not using the new keyword. But it's not very important. And this is because strings are immutable in Java. Now in this course, I will not talk about immutable classes. All you need to know is that a string is an object and the type is a string, and we don't have to use the new keyword in order to create a new string, alright? Now, since a string is an object, then we can use the dot operator on the variable x. You will see that this variable x has a lot of useful methods. For example, there is a method that is called char at that returns the character at a given index. So have some fun and try to execute some string methods. Now this is it regarding strings. Now let's talk about operators. First of all, let me close this. And just like any other programming language, we have arithmetic operators, plus, minus, multiplication, division. We also have the modulo operator, which I forgot to mention. We also have relational operators, less than, greater than, less than or equal, greater than or equal, and equal. And we have logical operators, the AND logical operator, the OR logical operator, and the NOT logical operator. And to test for inequality, we use the NOT logical operator with an equal sign. So this is it regarding the operators. Now let's talk about decisions. And by the way, we don't need this import statement anymore because we are not using the arrays class. Let's create a variable x which is equal to 5. And now let's write some conditions. So let's say if x is greater than 10, if this is true, we are going to print greater than 10, for example. And if this is not true, let's test if x is less than 10, then I'm going to print less than 10. And if all the previous conditions are false, I will print x is equal to 10. So I hope that you can see how we can use if and else statements in Java. And of course, for example, over here, we can add brackets, and inside the brackets, we can put the statement. But I didn't add the brackets because I have one statement only inside the if statement. And the same thing applies for the else statement. We can add some brackets, and inside here, we can put our statement. So over here, I want to switch the value of x. First of all, I will test if the value of x is equal to 10, for example. In this case, I'm going to print equal 10. And then I want to break out. I don't want to execute the cases that are below this case. Now, if x is not equal to 10, then I'm going to test if it is equal to 15. And now let's print, for example, equals 15. And I will not put a break statement over here. This means that all the cases that are below this case over here will be executed because we didn't put a break statement. So over here, I will see if x is equal to 20, and I'm going to print case below 15. And finally, I will break. And now over here, I'm going to add a default case. Inside it, let's print default, for example. So this is how we use switch statements in Java. So let's take some examples. If x is equal to 10, then this case over here will be executed, and then we will break out of the switch. If x is equal to 15, then this case over here will be executed, and also this case. Because as you can see over here, we didn't break out of the switch. So both these cases will be executed, and after that we will break outside of the switch. Now suppose that x is equal to 20. This means that this case will be executed, and then we will break out. And now suppose that x is equal to 30. In this case, the default case will be executed. This is it regarding decisions. Now let's talk about loops. First of all, I will talk about the for loop. So let's say I want a for loop. I will use a variable called I starting from 0, for example. I should be less than 10 and I++. Inside this loop, I want to print the element at index I of an array, for example. Suppose that the array is called ints. So we will access the element at index I and we will print it. So let's print. I will print the element at index I, and then I will concatenate a space. So as you see, we can use the plus operator to concatenate a string. Over here, we are concatenating a number with a space. So the number will be converted to a string, and then it will be concatenated with a space. Now let's create our array. So let's say we want an array of integer that is called ints, and it is equal to a new integer array. And over here, I will show you how to initialize arrays. So we will use curly braces, and over here we will put our elements. Let's put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for example. So over here we created an integer array of 5 elements, which are these elements over here, okay? And inside this loop, we are iterating over this array and printing each element. But as you see over here, we are iterating as long as I is less than 10. This should be 5 or we will get an error because we will exceed the bounds of the array. So instead of typing the number over here, let's get the number of elements in the ints array. So put the name of our array and then use the dot operator. And over here we see that we have a variable or a field that is called length. And this represents the number of elements in our array. So now if we modify the elements over here, our code will work without any problems. So run the program and this is the output. Now let's see how this for loop is being executed exactly. First of all, we will define a variable I which is equal to 0 and we will use this variable in the for loop. Then we will check the condition. We will check if I is less than the length of our array. If this is true, we will execute the statement inside the for loop. And of course, we can put some braces for the for loop if we want to put more than one statement. After we execute the statement in the for loop, we will increment I. We will execute I++. So we are going to increase the value of I by 1. And after that, we will check the condition. If I is still less than the length of the array, we will execute the statement in the for loop again. This will continue until the condition is no longer true and we will exit the loop. Now let's convert the for loop to a while loop. So I'm going to use a variable I starting from 0 and I want a while loop. I will iterate as long as I is less than the length of the array. And inside this loop, I'm going to print the element at index I concatenated with a space. And after that, I want to increment I. And this will give us the same result. And this is our output. And each number is on a new line because we are using the println method, not the print method. Now let me close this and I want to modify the code a little bit. I will remove this statement and remove the braces. Now we only have one statement inside the while loop. Now in order to increment the value of I will increment it over here. I'm using post increment, so after using the current value of I will increment it. If you know nothing about increment and decrement, make a small research about them. They are not very hard. So run the program, we have the same output. Now we still have one type of loop, which is the for each loop. Let's use a for each loop in order to iterate over our array. So let's say we want a for loop and we want an element I. We will iterate using this element over our array. And each time we will print this element concatenated with a space and we will use the print method. So this is a for each loop in Java. Run the program and as you see, this is our output. In this case, we are not using indices. Each time the variable I will take the value of an element in the array, starting from the first element until the last element. Now this is it regarding loops. Now let's talk about functions and scope. As we said, this main over here is a function, and we call it a method because it is a function inside a class. So let's create our own function or our own method. Let's say that it is a public method, it is a static method, it returns an integer and it is called f. It takes no parameters and inside it we will return 5 for example. Now let's discuss these keywords. This public keyword is related to object-oriented programming, so we can remove it. This static keyword is because we want to use this method inside the main method. The main method is a static method. So to be able to use the method f inside the main method, f should be static, okay? And after that we have the return type of the function, then the name of the function, then the list of parameters, and then the code of the function. So in the main method, let's print the function f for example. So f will be executed and it will return 5, so we will see 5 printed. So let's change f a little bit. I'm going to return a string that is read from the user. So over here, look what I'm going to do. I will create a new scanner object and give it system.in in order to read values from the command line. And now over here, we have a scanner object and we can use the dot operator on this object. To read a string from the user, we use the next or the next line methods. The next method reads a string until it reaches a space or a new line. And the next line method reads a string until it reaches a new line. So over here we are reading a sentence from the user and returning it from the function f. So the type of the function should be a string. And as you see, we are using the function f inside the main method. So let's run the program. Now the program is waiting for us to enter a sentence. Of course, we can enter a word or a group of words. If we are using the next method, only the first word will be read. But since we are using the next line method, we will read the whole sentence with the spaces. So now let's press enter. And as you can see, after reading the string, we returned it. So we are printing it and we see it printed over here. Now let's talk a little bit about scope. Since we are not talking about classes, we will just talk about local variables. A local variable is a variable inside a method. So for example, inside the main method, I'm going to create a variable called x, and inside the method f, I will also create a variable that is called x. And let me change the type of this method to be void because I don't want to return anything from inside it. Now what you need to know over here is that the x of the method f is not related to the x of the method main. Each method has its own variables. Now inside the main method, let's try to create another variable x. You will see that we have an error because we already have a variable called x in the main method, right? So now we say that in the scope of the main method, we have a variable that is called x, and we cannot declare a variable of the same name inside the same scope. Now let me start a new scope over here. So I'm going to open some braces. This might seem a little bit weird for you, but no problem. You can imagine that we are using a for loop or an if statement, anything with a set of braces. What's important is that these braces are inside the braces of the main function. So inside these braces, we have a new scope. Now let's try to create a variable called x inside these braces, and we'll get an error. So the rule is the following. Inside inner scopes, we cannot have a variable with the same name as a variable in the outer scope, okay? So inside the scope of the main function, we already have a variable that is called x. And this scope over here is inside the scope of the main function because it is inside the braces of the main function. So we cannot have a variable inside this scope that is called x. This will give us a problem. So let's change the name of the variable for y, for example. Now we will have no problems. So now in this scope over here, we have a variable that is called y. But now have a look over here. Outside this scope, I will try to print the variable that is called y. We will get an error. Have a look. Cannot resolve symbol y. This is because we declared the variable y inside this scope, and you are trying to use it outside it. You can imagine that the life of the variable y starts from this statement until the end of this scope. So we can use the variable y over here, for example, okay? But after we reach this brace, the variable y is destroyed. It no longer exists in the memory. This is why we can't access it over here. Now let me move this statement inside the inner scope, and now we have no problems. We can access the variable that is called y inside this scope. But have a look, we still have an error. This is not related to scope. The error says that the variable y might not have been initialized. This is because in Java, before using any variable, we must initialize it, okay? It doesn't necessarily have to be initialization, we can simply assign it, for example, like this. And this is it related to scope. I hope that you found this video helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.